Cyber liability is so new that 5 years ago no one even knew what it was, and now it's a coverage that companies need, but they don't know that they need it because they don't have coverage for it. This program is important because of the upturn we've seen in cyber breach, as well as the cost to businesses for cyber breach. Most companies don't realize what the expense will be, and it can be astronomical. Our presenters will be from Beazley Group, which is a London-based insurance company. The Beazley Group is the leader in breach response as well as cyber liability. We'll also have people from R.K. Harrison, who is a London broker that is on the leading edge of cyber breach.
These gentlemen that are here this morning hopefully will share with you some ideas, some concepts. They're real-world people that are dealing with this subject every day. The other thing I would say is, as you think about this subject, I would strongly recommend, because there's a lot of information out there right now coming from a lot of different sources, and a lot of it is not accurate, and a lot of it is conjecture. Make sure wherever you're getting the information, it is credible and it's people that are really involved in it. And that's why, again, we're pleased to have this group. And on that note, we'll cut right to it. Alex?
So we're going to really focus on a lot is about the different types of breaches that occur out there, sort of get rid of some misconceptions that are out there about them. And we'll also talk about how to respond to them and look at some examples of events that went well. And we'll talk about a few examples of events that didn't go so well. So at the end of the day, we want to get an appreciation about what really are these events that they keep calling data breaches, these cyber events, these privacy events. It's not all about the Targets, the Home Depots, the JP Morgans. We can touch on some of that, but quite frankly, I want to stay out of the stratosphere, because the likelihood of one of your organizations having that 100 million person event, 50 million person event, probably pretty rare, and you're probably thanking yourself and saying that's good. So I'm going to talk about a little boring stuff. I'm going to talk about the 100 person events, the 500 person events, the 1,000 person events. Why? Because those are the ones that practically every organization that's represented here is likely to face. And those are those that get you. Those are the liability points. And what we're going to focus on a lot as well is I'm going to try and get rid of this misconception or this myth that most of the liability comes from the breach itself. Everybody's so concerned about, oh my gosh, all these lawsuits and class actions and all these regulators. Everybody focuses right away on that. And they lose sight that, guess what, the majority of the liability is not really there. It's the lack of experience on how you assess, investigate, and respond to it. So way before a claim comes in, way before someone sues you, way before a regulator knocks on your door, I can assure you, you got plenty of opportunity to raise your liability, and that's what we're going to focus on this first hour. All right, so obviously I got to get a little disclaimer out of the way. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give you professional legal advice, but certainly let's take a lot of this information to bear. There's some good practical points and practices you can take back today, and even embark upon with your teams back in your respective organizations. So hopefully it'll put you in a better preparedness perspective from, knock on wood, not having one of these events occur. So again, we're going to start off very much with a brief review about breaches. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of misconceptions about what exactly is a data breach. And even worse is there's a lot of misconceptions on how to respond to them. And those are the liability pitfalls we want you to hopefully avoid and not raise your liability further beyond what the event itself will bring. I told you I'm not an attorney, but we're going to go to law school for about 5 minutes. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are the regulations and the laws out there. And some of them will be obvious to you and some may not, because there are some regulations that many organizations were never thinking about or had on their radar. And we want you to be mindful of certain types of regulators that potentially could be knocking on your door as well. We'll talk about a few cases. So Again, we want to at least present how some events went well and why did they go well, but we'll also talk about some other matters that might raise your eyebrows and be like, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. Or, oh my gosh, I would have handled the event the exact same way and I would never have thought of that liability. So we want to bring a few cases to bear and have a discussion here. And then I'll just wrap up with some very quick bullets of some best practices that you can take back, as I said, today, right back to your teams and put you in a better position tomorrow than you were today. So the most fundamental question I get asked all the time, what's a data breach? It's not going to be one single answer. Unfortunately, we have a variety of regulations and laws, and they all define a breach differently. And everybody then says, well, then which law do I have to follow? And unfortunately, I always have to tell the clients, you got to follow all of them, because you have to sort of break down your breach to the different regulations and the different jurisdictions. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we go to law school. I'll tell you how that applies. But you don't have one single definition. You're always going to have to be looking at different definitions of breaches, what triggers these different laws. And this is a very complex process. This is where some of the liability can arise, is just not knowing how these laws are triggered. But if I had to give you a fundamental definition, something to base off of, it's what we have here and on the next slide. It's the release or disclosure of that information that causes inconvenience or harm to either a person or to a corporate entity, to a company. If we sort of take that definition, we're going beyond what the law says. I'm taking actually a little bit more of a conservative approach. So a good example. What if a hacker got into your organization and stole all the email addresses of your customers? Aside from 2 states, California and Florida, no state notification law is going to require you to notify anybody. But if we go back to my previous slide, is that going to cause inconvenience or harm to the individual? I would guess yes. If you're talking about a hacker who intentionally stole these email addresses, there's a good chance that he or she is going to send fake emails, phishing attacks, spear phishing, looking to get financial information out of your customers. So although the law may not be triggered defining it as a breach, I sure would be treating it as such, and I'd probably start to investigate it as such. So lesson here, don't rely on just what the laws are telling you is a breach. Look at exactly at what has happened and can it still cause inconvenience or harm to an individual or to another entity. If it does, you should be starting to treat it and investigating it appropriately as an event. Now, if we start looking at what causes these events, it is not all about the Chinese hackers. It's not all about the 100 million person events that you see in the papers. There's a variety. It's a very broad spectrum on how these events occur. And I told you, some of this is going to be boring. This is not going to be the big, CSI investigation episode and talking about the hackers getting in. Improper disposal of data is the #1 cause we, at least at Beazley, see. And if you'll notice, I'm talking about paper records first. So, big lesson here. We hear about cyber insurance, cyber liability, cyber attacks. Everybody immediately thinks electronic data. Network security, your network infrastructure. Guess what? About 1/5 of the breaches that occur are paper-based. So it's not the majority, but it's a formidable number. You can still have a good number of these events, these liability exposures, and they have nothing to do with your network, nothing to do with your IT infrastructure, nothing to do with your electronic data. It's the boring events. #1 cause, unshredded documents. If you don't have shredders and shredder bins easily accessible to your workforce, guess what happens? Your employees throw it in the round file next to their desk. And when the custodians pick up the garbage, throw it in the dumpster behind your office building, guess who we have to worry about getting into the dumpster at 2 in the morning? The answer is not the criminals. Believe it or not, there's enough examples of regulators who send their staff through dumpsters to look for unshredded information. So I don't have to tell you to look any further than if you go Google a few attorneys general around the country, particularly Texas, California, Massachusetts, you will find that they pretty much ride on finding these events because it's part of their political drive. We all know AGs like to grow up to be senators and governors. So there's a political drive to this. Some senators now, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut, then Attorney General Blumenthal, his entire campaign was run on this. So we don't have to just worry about the bad guy or gal getting the data. We have to think about the regulators who might actually be going out of their way to see if you're creating a breach. So shredders, shredder bins being easily accessible, easy fix that can resolve a lot of those types of headaches. File cabinets. If any of your organizations are going through mergers and acquisition activity, facility shutdowns, office consolidation, there's always excess office equipment. There's always extra file cabinets, desks, facilities. When the last person turns off the lights and walks out, or that equipment is sold off or donated to charity, you need someone to wear the privacy hat. And it's got to check every drawer, every closet, every file cabinet before it leaves. We have seen enough breaches where those file cabinets are donated to a charity. The charity opens the drawers, and what do they find? Patient files, employee records, you name it. You don't want that to happen. We have to talk about x-rays. So if anyone here is in the healthcare sector, Beazley last year had 12 hospital breaches across the US where we had criminals impersonate the x-ray disposal company. They got the uniform, they come in at midnight, 1 in the morning, they see the security guard, God bless, working the graveyard shift, here to pick up the old x-rays. Security guard sees the uniform, escorts them to the basement, down to the archive room, and they steal by the barrelful the old black and white x-rays. Criminals aren't taking those x-rays because of the medical information. For those that may not know, you can actually melt old x-rays, and there's a significant amount of silver content in the x-ray film. So the criminals want the silver content from those images. Unfortunately to the hospital, that's a breach. They have to investigate it and ultimately respond under HIPAA high-tech and probably a variety of state notification laws. So again, be mindful of credentialing who's coming on your site. And as I ever so scientifically call it, anyone leaving with a lot of stuff, you want to be able to vet them out. You want to be able to credential them. You don't want someone in your premises doing that kind of theft, if you will, and leaving with it. That is, again, where we see a lot of these events occur. And then we also have to talk about disposing your electronic assets. So if any of the IT professionals in the room, you'll probably relate that you probably get enough phone calls from the employees who are always clamoring for that new laptop or that new desktop because theirs is too slow. So we always know that organizations are refreshing their laptops and PCs and the like. We got to do something with those old equipment, that old computer, that old laptop. We hope there's proper wipe down practices in your organizations. I don't have to tell you to look any further than eBay. If you go to eBay and look at who's buying old laptops, surprise or not, the majority of the people buying them are coming from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. It's not because there's a lack of devices there. It's because they know most consumers are not good at wiping down the hard drives. They want the data that's on there. So you want to make sure you have that same practice. You'll notice in my list I include a few other things. Printers, copiers, fax machines, scanners. In this day and age, those are essentially computers. So guess what? There's a hard drive on those devices. You want to make sure those devices are wiped down as well. If any of you lease those office pieces, I certainly hope in your leasing contracts you have good provisions that assure upon the end of a lease, any asset that's being returned, the hard drive is wiped down on site. You don't want it wiped down when it leaves and it goes back to their facility. Last December, there was a healthcare organization in the Chicago area. They had a lease on a copier. The copy lease was up. The leasing company took the copier back and they released it to another company. As Murphy's Law would have it, that other company was CBS News in Chicago. And the CBS News investigative journalists there in the bureau decided, we have a new copier. I'd love to see what's on this hard drive. They brought in a forensics firm and they found 800,000 patient files still sitting on the copier's hard drive. So be mindful again of those kinds of provisions if you are leasing those equipment pieces to have those drives wiped down when the lease is up. And then we get to things that are pretty routine, unfortunately and regrettably. Phishing attacks, spear phishing, these things are still happening. They're not going away. Phishing is actually a little bit on the decline, but spear phishing is considerably on the rise right now. And it's not on the rise just for the Apples and the Microsofts and the Googles of the world. Hackers are breaking into everyday organizations to get email addresses of customers. And what they want to do is, since they know 100% of those email addresses are associated to the company they just hacked into, they can have a better penetration rate of sending a fake email like that company to see these people provide social security numbers, credit card numbers, login credentials, what have you. So we have to be mindful of safeguarding things as simple and trivial as email address lists as you would for like a social security number or a credit card number. Network intrusions and hacks, really nothing new to report here other than to say they're still happening. So we just have to expect that, and we don't see that ever going away. Organizations are always going to have to deal with this kind of a security compromise. And then we get to lost, missing, or stolen electronic assets. If you have employees that use laptops, thumb drives, smartphones, tablets, it's 2014. If you're not encrypting those devices, you really need to be considering that. Putting encryption on those portable devices, virtually every state notification law, except Massachusetts, will give you what's called a safe harbor. They say you get an out. You don't have to notify people if the device was encrypted. That's a great way to prevent a data breach from ever having to be reported. So it's as I call it, a no-brainer. You really need to consider encryption on those portable devices these days. We get to a fancy phrase here called mishaps due to broken business practices. It's just a fancy phrase for human error. It's the oops moments. So we're all human. And so you can have the best IT infrastructure, the best IT staff in place, the best practices and policies established for your employees, but we're human. We make mistakes, and mistakes will occur. I've seen, I know we have a good university presence here. One of the biggest errors I've seen happen with universities, the alumni newsletters that go out the door. I've seen enough universities that accidentally put the student's social security number on the mailing label when they send those out. So guess what? You have a breach. That's an accident. Nobody intended to do it. It was purely accidental. But guess what? Those things happen. So you have to be mindful of those kinds of scenarios. We all have halos above our heads, right? Not everybody does. So we have to think about the rogue employee. There's enough examples of this as well where, again, you may have someone who's disgruntled, you may have an employee who's looking to leave the organization, is on their way out, and they have the intent sometimes to take information they're not supposed to. Particularly here in the southeast part of the U.S., and regrettably some of it has spread into Alabama. Think about Georgia, Florida, and Alabama region. For the last 2 years, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's been a huge identity theft crime ring amongst HR employees of hospitals, where criminals are going to HR employees of hospitals not looking for information on patients, but rather surgeons, nurses, physicians, and getting their social security numbers and names, and they're filing false tax returns with the IRS to get tax refund checks. So this has been going on for 2 years now. So if you can imagine, the IRS, FBI, Secret Service, they've all been heavily involved for now dealing with this. And it is not going away anytime soon. It has been a big, big issue so far in this part of the country. So think again, rogue employees are another exposure point. So when you look at what I've just talked about between this slide and the previous one, it's a pretty broad spectrum of exposure, and many of it, quite frankly, it doesn't just sit in that cyber world. So if you could take a little lesson away from today, look at privacy. That's what we're calling this. We're calling it privacy risks, privacy liability, because in fact it does go beyond the electronic realm. So now we had an event. What do? So everybody sort of wants to get a sense of what's the game plan? How do we attack this? Unfortunately, every event, every breach is different. And so you don't necessarily have a cookbook. It's not a recipe where we do step 1 this day, we do step 2 this day. You have to have a framework. You have to have sort of a little bit of an overview game plan of how do we approach this. And everybody always asks me, Alex, what do you think is the best way we should attack this? I always give them this visual. It's a very fundamental visual to show what's that timeline look like in terms of, regrettably, what you're about to face. So think of it as 4 phases. So we have phase 1. Phase 1 is what we call the discovery phase. This is the aha moment. This is the moment someone or some entity identifies something is not right. So I'll give you a few examples. One, it could be an employee who comes in tomorrow and she tells her manager that her work laptop was stolen from her vehicle last night. It could be the HR director who comes in Monday morning, opens the office, and sees that the HR office was ransacked. File cabinet drawers are open, paper records are all over the place. It could be the IT professional who's identified that malware and a virus got into the network and they found it on a few servers that had client or patient information. Or it could be one of your vendors, one of your third-party vendors that you have handed your data to do a business purpose. In their environment, they had a breach, and now they're telling you about it. I just gave you 4 quick examples. There's 1,001 others. The important thing is you want all of those different discoveries to get funneled into the same consistent methodology we're about to talk about. It's when you don't follow a consistent approach and heaven forbid you have a regulator knocking on your door. Regulators do not like that. They want to see a consistent methodology for every kind of discovery of an event you have. When you start changing that around, they don't like that. They view that you might be favoriting a certain event over another because of a certain profile of people affected. It really sends a bad message. So you want to have a very consistent methodology. From that discovery, we have to investigate. Don't assume. We all know what happens when we assume. So you don't want to assume you know what has happened. You have to investigate it to determine the true facts of what has happened. Now, usually that investigation, at least in our opinion of our approach and how we handle these events, more often than not, but not 100% of the time, will warrant you pulling in 2 specialized resources. One, legal. Again, we're not talking about defense counsel, because at this point in time when that employee reported her laptop stolen from her vehicle, you have nothing to defend. There's no claim. No one sued you, no regulators knocking on your door. We don't need a defense attorney. We need an actual privacy attorney who knows not only the privacy laws, but more importantly, knows where those pitfalls are as you investigate it, knows the pitfalls and how to respond to the event. That's someone you need right now. And more often than not, that's not going to also be your traditional outside counsel. I would suspect every organization here has an outside counsel representation. They're probably good for dealing with your typical corporate needs, tax purposes, things like that. They probably don't have that experience under their belts on how to manage a data breach. And so you want to have a very specialized counsel here for that. Then, more importantly, heaven forbid, you have to notify regulators. What if you have to notify various attorneys general around the country? Does your outside counsel who sits here in Montgomery, Alabama, know Martha Coakley, the AG in Massachusetts? And more importantly, does Martha Coakley, the AG of Massachusetts, know your outside counsel who sits here in Montgomery? If they don't, I can assure you most attorneys general, when they don't recognize the attorney who's representing you, that just opens the door that they want to investigate because they don't know the confidence level of how this is going to be handled. They're concerned about their constituents. So you know what? You just open the door a little bit more for that regulator. So you want to use a counsel who's well-versed not only in the privacy end, but the regulators know. 2, you might be asked and you might have to consider bringing in a forensics firm. So I often get asked by, I'm an engineer by degree, so I'm a technologist, so I always sympathize to my IT counterparts. I often get told I don't need a forensics firm. I have the best IT team. The head of our IT is former NSA. We built this network from scratch. They know it the best. We don't need any forensics firm coming in. Important lesson. When forensics is brought in, it is never a reason of competency of who you have in place today. You're bringing in that forensics firm for a legal defensible position, and it serves you well twofold. It serves you well because, one, you're bringing in a so-called impartial third-party entity to help investigate with your in-house team. Why would you want that? Well, if we ever get to phase 4 and I have to worry about lawsuits and litigation matters, I never want a plaintiff's bar to go cry, oh, that's the fox guarding the hen house. They did their own investigation. How credible is it? I never want to have that be the starting argument of any litigation matter. So when you bring in that forensics firm, you're establishing that impartial position right from the start. That's really important. The second value proposition, why should we bring in forensics? When forensics is brought in, we often recommend to the client, don't retain the forensics work directly. Let that privacy attorney retain the forensics work. And the reason we do that is there's a little doctrine known as the attorney work product doctrine. What that means is whatever gets found in that investigation, we want it to be a little privileged, if you will, with the privacy attorney, that anything found that has nothing to do with the breach doesn't go in the forensics report that winds up in the hands of a plaintiff's attorney later. Because one of the things I can assure you will happen virtually 100% of the time, when you investigate a breach, you're gonna find other vulnerabilities and other liabilities of your organization you were not prepared to find today. So in my past, I've handled breaches before, and many years before Beazley, and I had a very unfortunate client, very unfortunate situation where we were investigating a breach matter. And regrettably, our forensics team, we stumbled on a child pornography ring amongst employees. Really bad. Federal law, we had to report that right away. But because we had that attorney work product doctrine privilege with outside counsel, guess what? This is bad, but it doesn't go in this report. Because the last thing I need is that report to be in the hands of a plaintiff's attorney and giving them a roadmap of other lawsuits to throw at you. You want to be able to only contain relevant findings in that report. And the only way and the best argument to do that is under that type of model. So when forensics is ever recommended to you, definitely have your IT folks appreciate this is nothing about their competencies. It's all about defensibility. We want to have that right approach to keep you defensible as you go through this investigation. Now, at the end of that evaluation, we have a decision to make. Either we have a breach or we don't. If we do not have a breach, in our industry, we call those non-events. That's good. We like non-events. That means we dodged the bullet. We don't have to notify anybody. We've proven we do not have a breach. So that's good. But we all know not all events wind up that way. So if the event, in fact, is proven to be a breach, we go to phase 3. So phase 3 is where we have to now think about, okay, what are our obligations under the law? Do we have to send notices to these people? Do we have to notify state agencies or regulators? Do we have to offer a remedy? And most people often think of a remedy as credit monitoring. But let's get something clear. Credit monitoring is not the end-all be-all remedy. You're not going to offer credit monitoring 100% of the time. Some breaches, credit monitoring, are useless. The best example I can give you to that is what happened to our friends up in Minneapolis called Target. In my humble opinion, for the vast, vast majority of the people affected by the Target event, they should never have been given credit monitoring. Why? Because what happened is the general populace equated that credit monitoring with that credit word in it helps credit card breaches with the credit word in it. And they don't. Credit monitoring is not going to pick up fraudulent charges on your existing lines of credit. It's going to pick up if someone opens up a new line of credit as you. So it will help if someone opens up a credit card as you, or opens up a mortgage, or opens up another loan, or what have you. But if I took someone's credit card from here, the best I can do is go to the closest mall and go shop till I drop until they shut down the card. But with your credit card number, I can't open up another line of credit. I can't get a mortgage as you from that. So unfortunately and regrettably, I think in my humble opinion, Target could have handled that a little differently because they now have given a false sense of security to the public. That credit monitoring helps with credit card losses or credit card fraud. And we want to be mindful of that that's not the right remedy to have afforded. So you may also have a breach that doesn't involve people that credit monitoring will help. For example, what if you have a breach that involves deceased people or minors or non-US citizens? Guess what? None of those individuals could get any help from US credit monitoring. Or let's turn it on what kind of data was compromised. What if you didn't compromise social security numbers, but instead you compromised email addresses or login credentials or pure medical information, meaning medical diagnosis information? How on earth is credit monitoring going to help people? So we have to recognize you have to match the right individual to the right data compromise to get the right remedy for them. And that is another big misconception, is people assume credit monitoring is for every type of event we have, and it's not. And then we have to talk about PR. So now you've decided you have a breach, you have to get letters out the door, you have to offer a remedy, we have to get a call center established to help all these hundreds of thousands of people possibly calling in with questions. But we have to get the messaging out. And guess what? This is pretty obvious. You get one shot at getting the message right, because once it's out, you can't pull it back. So what happens if you have an event that is over 100,000 people? That's what I call a large event. You're going to get media attention. What happens if your breach is only 10,000 people, but those 10,000 people represent 80% of a town or a community? Everybody uses the same gas station, the same dry cleaner, the same grocery store. Or what happens if you have a breach of 10 and one of them just happened to be your governor, or happen to be Tom Cruise, or happen to be someone of notoriety? I can assure you, you're going to get media attention for a small 10-person breach if any of those individuals were part of the event. So if you look at those three scenarios, you're likely going to need some assistance on strategizing your public messaging. And guess what? I put public relations up here for point of clarity to make you hopefully appreciate what that's for. But believe it or not, PR firms are not who you want to use. Why? Because PR firms have one goal in mind. That's to put your organization in the news as much as possible. And I can assure you right now that that's the last thing you want. You want to be kept from being in the news as much as possible. So you have to be pulling in the right resource for that. And there are some specialized firms. Sometimes they are called crisis communications firms. The other buzzword I often am starting to hear is reputational risk advisory services. That's the new one. So those are the talents you want to pull in. And most of the larger PR firms, they have what's called crisis units within them. But it's important to note, if you have one of these events, you want to use that crisis unit, not your day-to-day typical PR rep, because odds are they don't know that strategy of the opposite strategy of keeping you from being in the news. And you want to make sure that that happens. I have seen some breaches where they pull in a traditional PR rep and their approach to the strategy is awful. They raise further liability because they want to subject the location of what happened with the breach, and they want to have media here and hold a press conference at the data center and stuff. No, those are things you don't want to do. So you want to make sure you pull in the right talents there. So the message here is, if we handle phases 1, 2, and 3 correctly, we really have the best odds and the best chance of minimizing, and dare I say, in some cases, eliminate phase 4. And that's our goal. Our goal is we have to be prepared for phase 4 right from the beginning. But if we do the right methodology up front, it gives us the best odds of eliminating the claims from ever coming in the first place. And so that is sort of how you want to create your methodology. You want to make sure you take the best of breed of practices out there from folks that have handled thousands of breaches and put that game plan up front in place. And it's your best shot, if you will, to hopefully minimize the impact coming from those claims coming in at the end of the day.